It is a Friday morning in Venice at the beach, foggy morning, clouds overhead, but I will assure you the sun is still out, regardless of how it seems to us under the haze of a morning fog. And we're here to talk about that in relation to our thinking and how thinking can seem to obscure reality and truth and act like reality and truth when in fact it's simply something we do within the context of an absolute knowing truth and reality that we are all seamlessly and essentially without negotiation seamlessly interwoven into, and those are all just narratives to suggest that we are a part of something we cannot be a part of, from. And the mental obsession is talking about what do we do in thought that triggers these sort of obsessive rants and these very preoccupied thought processes that give us an impression that somehow we're alone and somehow we're apart and somehow we're distinguishable in terms of what we think as who we are, rather than just see that our thoughts are always changing and considering things and always thinking. And it isn't who we are that they are defining. It's simply something we do that is being defined by the thoughts that we have. So today I have a friend, Neal, relatively new friend. We met recently at a meeting, and I spoke at the meeting, and he came and talked to me, and we've been talking ever since, and had some very interesting conversations for as little time as we've spent. But I wanted to invite him because he has a capacity for this conversation, and his history, now that I know a little bit more about it, is in the arts and creativity. And my sense is, as I had explained to him a little before we got on here, that life is the ultimate art, and the mastery of our ability to express this intuitive knowing, which is intuition is knowledge beyond reason, which means it's not something born of thought, it's not something coming out of understanding, it's not something reasonable or logical. It's actually a knowing of knowing that doesn't have doubt, it isn't uncertain, it isn't waffling and changing. It's an absolute state of being, which we are human beings. It's an absolute state we might call spiritual or any other name to attach to it to get beyond the bounds of the human relative experience that we seem to be having. And if that knowing is knowledge, then we all know it. Then we all have it. Then we all, talking on the basis of it, have a much better chance to actually express it rather than make believe all we are is independent and individual, separate from each other as a result of the thinking we do, thinking all we are is what we think. So that's kind of a brief abstract, but I want to introduce Neal.
Thanks,
Good
Jack.
morning, Neal.
Good morning.
Very, very glad to have you here. And
Same.
yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversations, as I did this morning as we talked a little bit in preparation for saying hello publicly. And give us a little history.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Midwest, grew up in Toledo, Ohio. Um, Parents are have been together for about 50 years. They met in a barn in Maumee, Ohio at a dance when they were like 14 and 15 and, and got married, had 4 children. I'm third in line there. Um, 2 older brothers, a little sister. We all went to Catholic school, 12 years of Catholic school. Um, just like a normal, what seemed like a very normal upbringing. As I grow older, I figure out and find grace for my parents and understand that they were doing the best I can, for sure. But as I'm sure we'll get into it, some things you get conditioned with or from, and yeah, I'm starting to learn how to undo those. So Catholic school was very much just kind of what you did in Toledo, Ohio. Played sports, played hockey, golf, and tennis, was a huge athlete. Thought that I would be in the NHL as a senior in high school. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I sort of fell into art and creative work. I started taking design classes in high school, and that sort of led me into going into college, um, wanting to be a designer. Ohio State didn't think the same, but so I started doing sculpture, and I really just wanted to make and express myself, and it was scary and exhilarating, and I think that that's sort of just been um, the highs and lows of my life, really wanting to express myself, and be part of the thing, whatever it was, and but also being too afraid to be part of the thing, or judging the thing, and attempting to be a loner, or being a lone wolf. And I've sort of navigated a lot through feeling like a lone wolf. And it's just interesting coming into a 12-step program, realizing that I'm not alone. And especially in the last 6 months, um, really falling into a relationship with a higher power. Um, and so, did the college thing, partied quite a bit, didn't really know myself, didn't really know how to be an adult, but knew that I wanted these things. I wanted, quote, success, whatever that looked like. I wanted, um, again, I just go back to being a part of, and I always really just did not feel a part of. And during all of these times, everything felt normal. It felt like, meaning normal of just like whatever that success that I was looking for, it was going to just fall into my lap. So came from a really sort of privileged living, where my parents were covering me however they could, and it wasn't so much financial, but it was just emotionally they were attempting to feel my feelings, or uh, uh, protect me from feeling life. And so that just sort of translated into adulthood. And I was 30 years old, and I was going to ultimately die from alcohol, and it was time to get sober. I that first run, I did not stay sober. um I'm 37, and I have 2 years of sobriety. But throughout all of that, I've been building a career within the creative space, specifically graphic design. And that was truly because I got denied from a rather a public school, but still Ohio State's prestigious visual communication school. I very much was working at Ohio State, and those that stopped me from feeling like I was going to succeed. Same as in my addiction, I would drink at people or drink at situations. So my career was very much built on in spite of these others, whether they were real people or ideas. Um, but yeah, so graduated college, thought that I would just get the job, whatever it may be, this beautiful, graphic design job, and that just wasn't the case. And I was fighting that for a long time, and I didn't understand what it took to get to where you want to be. Um, and so times like that perpetuated. I was not only blocking myself to grow as a human being, and find a career, and find a voice. But when I felt like that wasn't happening, I would turn to a substance, and so it, I just, yeah, I speak on that because now, um, I'm living not exactly, but I'm living what I was searching and hoping for as, say, a 24-year-old that felt like I had the world by the balls, and it was, uh, I was one call away from getting that dream job. When in reality, I was just getting in my way because I just didn't know. And so if I could go and talk to that 24-year-old right now, I would let him know that these things have come true. I am living, and there's so much ahead of me. But right now, I am living the things that I dreamt about, as an 18-year-old or a 26-year-old, and that is a career, as a professional creative, living in Los Angeles, living in California. As a kid in Toledo, Ohio, I watched television and thought, wow, that's where I want to be, the mecca of entertainment. Um, And so, yeah, it sort of leads me to here, and just wild how life happens, and I end up going to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I meet someone like Jack. I didn't necessarily want to go to the meeting, but I go, and I'm just captivated by what this person's saying, and feel like I think like that. I just, it's amazing to hear these words coming from someone, just another person, and it's all pertaining, and it's all factual, based in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so, that sort of brings me to here, where we've been chatting for the last couple of weeks and having these conversations that I just feel, I mean, at times it's a lot to wrap my head around, but it's like permeating my soul, the things and the ways that you speak. And so, yeah, it's really,
Well, and
yeah,
it's really, in the illustrative narrative that we put words to, your soul is the essence of, if it's a soul. I don't know how all that adds up, and don't need to know. I know that whatever those combination of things are that we use words for, the words aren't as important as the essence of what they're referring to.
yeah,
So if it's a soul, I don't know that they're individual. I have a sense that if there's an absolute spirit or absolute knowing knowledge or an absolute state of infinite being, that there is no division. So no part or place of it. And it must be something we all share. But there may also, like we have bodies that seem independent and brains that we can think for independently, there may be some distinction amongst the spirit, that spirit has a knowing sense, but also has an independent urge to do things collectively.
mm-hmm.
Recognizing that the collective is really we are all affected by everything that's happening, not just the things we think are happening. It's what we think of everything that's happening every moment that is really affecting us. So we're never thinking exclusively about ourselves. We're only thinking the thoughts we're having are exclusive to ourselves, which is not quite right.
And that's me unraveling. When you said in that meeting, it was essentially thinking about the thinking about the thinking. I forget exactly how you say it, but you're talking about those layers.
Yeah.
That was when, like, I was just like so locked in.
Well, that's an interesting word, because the idea, my sense is that it's a reactive thought is reacting to itself. It's reacting to the image of itself, just like we would react if we stood in front of a mirror and argued with the mirror to change how it sees us. It would be an impossible job, because while we're standing there arguing with it, we're standing there projecting the image we're asking it to stop reflecting. So the chain reaction in thinking is this idea that once a reactive thought starts, if I think who I am is that thought, I just keep reacting and reacting and reacting and reacting. That's basically addiction. It's addiction to thinking. And the misery of that, what does it lead to? Compulsive actions. I got to escape the thinking. I got to get over the thinking. I got to feel better than the thinking, because I can't live this way. The weight is too heavy. The burden is too much. I can't do this. And the struggle is actually telling us something's wrong. It's not saying you're an idiot, you're hopeless, you have no connection to reality. It's saying you're doing something wrong with what you have. What you have is thinking. You're using it in a way that is creating an effect that is impossible to live with, because it's completely delusional to even think it exists, other than the repetition of giving this credit to this image that we're calling now real and who we are, when in fact it's literally a projection of thought. That's it. It isn't real. It feels real because our body reacts to the threat. We're actually threatening our entire bodily system and undermining all the bodily systems, the immune system and the metabolic system and the parasympathetic system and the nervous system. All those systems that are designed to help us keep balance are taxed by the stress and the pressure and the anxiety that we create.
Yeah.
So words, it's interesting to use those words. I mean, if you listen to the words, which we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, it's just watching the words isn't censoring the words. It's starting to notice the stories we're telling about the things that are happening. And we think those stories are real because we've developed the narrative that has all this imagery that relates to what we see in the world, and yet it's all completely happening in our own thinking. It's like our own movie going on inside our own head, and it's a horror film, and we're reacting to it as though there's people really dying and arms and heads really being severed. And yet we
Right.
end up manifesting those kind of seeming realities in the world to say, yeah, I knew that could happen. Yes, of course that can happen, based on that same sick thinking.
Mm. I love the metaphor of looking in the mirror and what was it? Getting upset with the mirror,
Yes.
the way it's reflecting your own.
You can't, the mirror can't see anything if you're not standing in front of it. Our thoughts don't do anything if we don't intend for them to do what they're doing. Thoughts may happen without us, but the content of those thoughts is a choice we make. How we infill the thoughts, those are choices we make. And they reflect the will of wanting something. Choices, as far as I'm concerned, is will. And every moment, if I'm making decisions about what's happening, I am making decisions that will lead to the will to want something, because those decisions are all assessing what's going on in favor of being able to make decisions that help me survive, help me prosper and survive and thrive, not just survive, but actually thrive. Our nature is to thrive and be abundant because nature is abundant, so that we have more to give than anyone would ever need. So nobody is ever left out of that equation. There's no starvation and there's no lack, and there's no lack right now, except to the terminology we use and who owns what and what we possess and things as though they're ours, when in fact they're all of ours. They're not just ours individually. We might have some legal title to the things, we might have some control over them, but that control is in fact responsibility. And if we're irresponsible about our thinking, we're not going to have those things very long, whatever they are.
Right.
If it's a
Right.
car, if it's a relationship, they're going to go away, because responsibility is what manifests productivity and functionality and all those things that are actual, because responsibility is the nature of existence. And if responsibility is responsible for all existence, if some absolute power is responsible for all that exists, we are responsible by nature, not as a negotiable, I take responsibility, you take responsibility. We're all responsible, period. And we can act irresponsibly. We're welcome to act irresponsibly because we have the freedom to make believe that what's impossible is possible. And when we feel condemned, it isn't condemned by reality, it's condemned by a thought that's simply projected, just thought, to be real, to be true enough to fight. Think of the chain react. Think of the image in the mirror. We think it's us. We even say that's me in the mirror. No, it's not us. It's a reflection. There's no blood, there's no air, there's nothing but an image, superficial image. It isn't real, and it isn't there any longer than we're willing to stand for it or stand in front of it. Same with these thoughts. As long as we continue to operate on the basis that who we are is what we think, for instance, which comes from thinking thoughts are reality and truth. So if I think my thoughts are reality and truth, I immediately make believe who I am is what I think. Because if I'm the creator of reality, who else would I be? It's delusion.
It makes me think about the excuse me, the mental obsession.
Yes.
Because I keep going back to this literal looking in the mirror, and well, the literal aspect of standing there looking at the mirror, seeing my reflection, and what I see is a product of how I feel. If I feel
What you're actually seeing is an absolute representation of what is in front of that mirror. And then the next step is, now it's, what do you think of that, what you're seeing?
yeah,
Right? Very different, because the real seeing, the real vision is the clarity and the perfect representation of that image. A mirror doesn't lie. It does not misrepresent. It does not have you look better or worse. It is a perfect reflection. And then we go to work on the thinking about what we're seeing because we think thinking is so profound that we can dismiss what's actually there and begin to overlay it with the ideas we have of what we think should be there and how we think that thing we're looking at should look. Just like we do with other people. We don't tend to deal with other people. We deal with what we think of them. We don't tend to listen to other people. We hear what we think they're saying, which tends to be only what aligns with our thoughts because we think they're real, because they're true, and because we would be threatened by them and have to call them an enemy if we didn't somehow convert what they're saying into something that aligned with what we were thinking.
I think about especially, thinking about the later stages of my use, I was so insecure. And that's what I keep going back to with this mirror metaphor of I'm attempting to figure out how you see me. And then that is determining the way that I see myself.
Well, it isn't actually. It's determining the way you're thinking of the self you think you are.
There you go.
So distinguishing and starting to see what we're doing in thought leaves the range of everything beyond those thoughts available to be considered. To think all we are is thoughts means that we have no perspective whatsoever because now I'm in the thought. Who I am is in the thought. There's no perspective in that any more than an eyeball can see an eyeball or the mirror can see itself, right? The mirror is just reflecting what's standing in front of it. And so we must be standing for what we're doing, meaning we are intentionally continuing to create this, thinking somehow someday it's going to get better the more and more we do it, because we're going to perfect it someday, when in fact it's the imperfection of what we're thinking in relation to what we're actually seeing that's causing that whole trigger and cycle to begin. We're thinking of it as what we think. It isn't what we think. What we think is what we think. What it is what it is. What we think of it is what we think. Starting to notice that puts thinking into a context of something we're doing, not who we are, not all we are, not the only thing we can do. If we can change our thoughts, because they're always changing, by the way, everything in a relative scheme is constantly changing. That's actually an absolute within the context of what we think is a divisible, dualistic experience.
Divisible, dualistic human experience.
Yeah. And we think of it that way, but it's in fact seamlessly. When you look at it all, if everything's changing, the one thing not changing is that everything's changing, which is age-old philosophy.
Yeah.
Aristotle, Socrates, Sophocles, all these guys from way back in the period when sandals was all anyone wore. It wasn't a privilege where you had to live at the beach.
Right. I have my slides on right now. I think about another thing that's coming up. Well, multiple things, but I'm listening to what you're saying and still thinking in literal terms of my relationship with a mirror.
Yes.
Because there's been times now where I don't look at myself in the mirror. And then there are other times where I utilize looking at the mirror, looking myself directly, looking at the reflection of my eyes and utilizing that as a way to connect with God. I don't think that I am God. I am not my higher power, but that is a way, that is a modality that I utilize to feel physically connecting with a higher power.
Well, if the higher power is defined, I mean, think of the big book. I don't imagine everyone listening is listening from a point of view of sobriety and being involved in a 12-step program. But what Bill Wilson did for alcohol to begin with is something that had never happened through human history. There had been little fits and starts, but it hadn't been put together in a way that gave alcoholics the chance to be salvaged. as though they were a waste product that no longer had use and went to the recycling program and actually came out a useful product. And that hadn't really happened. There were bits and fits and starts through history, but it hadn't really happened in the way that it happened when he put together what he put together and did what he did with all the different voices that he utilized to create the big book and start to talk about sobriety as something that was not only possible, but absolutely guaranteed if anybody was willing to do the things that were asked of them, which was really starting to be honest about what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So anything, if reality is anything, it's truth. And if within the context of listening to this conversation, you have any kind of recognition that something is being said that you relate to, you're starting to notice an awareness that we all have that we don't tend to talk about. So we tend to underutilize because we think that all we're doing is thinking about the thinking that we're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, that means there's nothing else going on for us than what we think. And if I don't think it's happening, it's no longer happening, or it's not happening, or it's never going to happen. So all that can happen is what I do repeatedly over and over and over again, which leads to these sort of dark, cavernous grooves that we seem to create that aren't really created, because in the presence of the presence, we're always free to do whatever we want. We've just gotten into the storyline to the point where we start thinking of it as deep and cavernous. Like people say, truth is deep. Like, no, it can't be deep. If it were deep, it would be inaccessible. It wouldn't be true to someone who was far away from it. That can't be the case. What's deep is the distance we keep from it, making believe that the further we get from it, the more we're controlling it, when in fact, that's really insanity to even think we could get away from it at all.
Even the phrase, "Oh, that's deep."
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
well, I hear people say it all the time. They say, it's too deep, I can't get it. And
right.
I'm like, well, if it isn't deep, you've got it. If the storyline you're using to give you the impression you're not getting it is simply a storyline, so you continue to maintain the impression, that isn't reality. That's just a thought centered on a thought.
Mm.
So even the self we talk about, when you talk about seeing yourself in the mirror, you're not actually seeing yourself, you're seeing your body.
And I like that distinction. I think that's a great distinction.
And it isn't to say we can't use the word self, but when we use it as though it's really who we are, that's really what ego is. And ironically, ego is thought to be a false impression of self, right? The actual roots of ego in Latin is the capital I.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually who we actually are. That's what ego is. But what have we done? Turned it around, turned it backwards. So we use the word in a complete different connotation to represent something that's false, but align it closely with something that's real to again show that we can be really deceptive and make believe what we're doing is true, when in fact it isn't true at all. It has no basis in anything other than our repetitive, permanent kind of obsessive thinking about it. We're trying to create permanence by thinking about it all the time in the same way and think that somehow or another it's going to magically become real, which, like the idea of truth being far away, means that apparently until we concluded what it was, reality wasn't real until we came to the rescue and finally thought of it in the proper terms. That's a stretch.
Right.
Rather than just say, no, I've been thinking dysfunctionally and I haven't been productive. And I haven't felt like I belong anywhere because I've been doing everything to insist I don't even belong where I am, thinking I need to be somewhere else because I'm so uncomfortable where I am, thinking these thoughts that I'm doing. I can't stand it. So I have to constantly imagine another place I might end up with something I never have to be happy someday.
Mm-hmm.
And find out that if I'm seeking, I'm claiming I'm not there. And if it's infinite, there's no other place it can possibly be but where we are now, always. And it can't come in amounts because it's not a time and space dimensional thing. It's beyond that.
It's interesting that you touch on self, because so often there's a few things linguistically that I do for the self. I say the self instead of myself.
Right.
And I sort of have to, in like certain, not every audience is going to understand what I'm saying when I say the self, regardless. But I also talk to the many selves, the many Neals. I touched on earlier, if I could talk to that 24-year-old Neal and whatever, let him know, yada, yada, yada. When I do talk to that 24-year-old Neal. I talk to 3-year-old Neal. I talk to 9-year-old Neal, and I talk to all of the Neals, all of the selves.
What you're
Uh,
really talking to are your thoughts about your thoughts.
but does that, so is that, I utilize that to sort of get to certain parts of what would be considered, I guess, shadow, or yeah,
Somewhere else.
shadow.
You think they're
Yeah.
somewhere else. They're hidden.
Realms.
They're hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you there are no secrets
Yeah.
anywhere. Everything that occurs has an immediate impact called an effect, cause and effect.
Mm.
So whatever we're doing in our thinking, here's a question. When you're thinking about 3-year-old Neal, where are you when you're thinking about him?
Right here is 37-year-old Neal.
Exactly.
For sure. For
Exactly.
sure.
So what are you doing?
Mm,
Thinking about something you think isn't here. And you
interesting.
think it's real. You think it's real. You think there's somebody to talk to. And you talk about the voices. My sense is every thought we have that we think is real comes with its own voice. And people talk often. You hear them in meetings say, the voices in my head are killing me. They're
Mm,
constantly chattering. What do they say? There's a committee constantly talking,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
So we not only have a split personality, we have a fractured personality with all kinds of different characteristics based on the individual thoughts that we think are real. Every one of those thoughts seems to have a persona attached to it that we think is who we are. And why wouldn't we be confused about who we are if we've got 800 or 900 of those chattering away on a regular basis and we're talking to them, trying to keep them quiet? We're talking to them as though they exist, like we're talking to the mirror as though it's going to respond.
Right.
So,
And
so it
yeah.
isn't to say we can't do that, but to start note when the scientists look into space and they say we're seeing the beginning of the universe, right? They're seeing it from the present. If they weren't present, they couldn't see that at all. And that thing they're seeing is present, but appears to be a reflection of something that happened in the past. But that past is present, which again nullifies time as reality and simply something that's a concept in a context that we're functioning within. There is no past or future in reality for us. It's always a thought that we're thinking about it that exists. There is no place for that stuff to be. We talk
It's
even about multidimensional space occupying all that past history, and perhaps the knowing nature stores all the information of everything that's ever happened, but it isn't anywhere other than in the present for everyone because it's indivisible. It's not like a computer, a cloud sourcing thing where you've got to be next to water to keep the whole thing cool, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger because they're maintaining more and more and more information. And this is an infinite source. There's no bigger it can get, and there's no smaller it can get because it isn't either. It's
mm,
always going to be big enough. It's always going to be substantial enough. It's always going to be infinite, which means there is absolutely no bound to it whatsoever. And to speak about that openly can seem absurd and grandiose, but it's actually grandiose not to talk about it and think it's absurd and grandiose. The grandiosity is making believe it's something that isn't our nature. So when we talk about it, it's supernatural, we call it. It's not supernatural, it's just nature. It's just the way it is, period. That's no bigger or smaller. That's humble. That's humility. Humility isn't humiliation, by the way.
right. 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 Right.
It's not trying to reduce or maximize something. It's just letting things be as they are.
I think what's difficult, and it's not even a difficulty, but I think we've just been, it's easier to think about these, like when you talk about like the grandiosity of what you're saying, where in reality it is not. I think it feels like it's too big, because I feel like,
But think of where that's coming from. Where would that be coming from that it feels too big?
well, like my perspective, my point in
Unlimited thought.
yeah.
So what's unlimited has no limit. So obviously, if you think the thought is real, it's going to seem really big and grandiose and hard rather than say, well, wait a minute. If it's infinite, the nature of my knowing awareness that I'm actually living with right now absolutely knows this. It isn't something I have to achieve by getting my thought there because I want to convince everyone that my thoughts are real.
Hmm.
And be on that parade that I've been marching to for most of my life, trying to prove to everybody that I know what I'm talking about.
Wow.
And it's all just thought. Thought can think it knows, but it doesn't know in the absolute sense that knowing knows, because knowing knows doesn't think at all. Why would it think? It has nothing to think about. It knows everything.
Yeah, that.
So now when you talk about it being easier, you begin to see the difficulty that has been created mentally for humans by taking for granted that the simple practical thing is to ignore the absolute state of our being and make believe that somehow that's a winning formula that's somehow going to pay off someday. And the payoff is the insanity. It's telling us point blank in the mirror that we're not looking accurately at what's happening. We're not talking accurately about what we're thinking. We're speaking of it in terms as though it's so real we can think and do nothing else. And that's textbook addiction to
Mm.
think.
In having these types of conversations, there's a sense that I think is just the sort of knee jerk or default feeling of, it's not helplessness, but it's like, well, then what am I supposed to do, right? And this is part of my question. It's like, what is the actionable? I almost feel like it's not the action. I'm trying, when speaking and having this awareness,
Yes.
are we then choosing to attempt to be ambitious? Are we choosing to go to work and know that we have to pay the bills, or succeed, or whatever? And I know these are all phrases that are contrived by humans, but how do you know what we're talking about, and also live and survive as a human being today?
So I think the real question is, how have we survived this long thinking those things weren't true?
Mm,
Think of that. Think of that for a practical answer. Think of the fact that we have been able to actually propagate at a rate that we have 8.5 billion people on this planet that are still surviving off
yeah.
of this dysfunctional basis of thinking that has led to toxic waste and corruption and poison and all these things that we think are normal. We think it's human nature. It is not human nature. We have normalized it and have become so accustomed to it that we think it's all we can do, just like we think thinking about thinking is all we can think and all we can know. And that's the most practical thing, because we say it's simple when that's a lie, because it's the most complicated thing ever undertaken by any species. Because you know
Right.
why? It's impossible to turn what is false into true. It is impossible to turn what's wrong into right. It is impossible to turn a lie into truth. That's the whole point of a lie. When a lie is no longer thought of as true, it's no longer a lie. It disappears. It doesn't have any basis other than the insistence. It isn't even what it is, because the claim is it's true. If a lie were claiming to be false, what would it be? Wouldn't even be a lie. It would always be nothing. It would not even be a consideration. It's the idea that we can segregate one aspect from the other, which is impossible. Like taking an extreme position doesn't eliminate the other positions. It doesn't claim, you might claim there is no other position but the one you're taking. But in fact, it confirms all other positions, because if you can take it freely and be crazy, so can everybody else take their position freely and be crazy about thinking there's no other position to take.
Right. And I think subsequently that is what happens.
Well, we're watching it. That's the amazing thing. The miracle to me is that we think miracles are miracles, because the healing nature of our body is well known. We don't think of it as something possible. We think of it as a miracle, while we think disease is absolutely possible and common and natural. That's a pretty sick basis for thinking. But to your initial point, Neal, because I think you made this when we first started talking, and I always laugh because I hear when people start getting this, when you subject your thinking to this idea that there's something absolute and infinite, and it minimizes your thinking to almost nothing, if not nothing, it leaves this sort of void which I would suggest shows that we have been largely not utilizing our thinking for thinking's purpose. We've been utilizing it as obsessive thinking and thinking that that's the only thing thinking can do. And once we think of not doing that, we say, what am I going to do now?
Exactly.
It's desperation has been so compelling that it's the only thing we could ever do, right? Think about the drinker. The idea for me, the idea of not drinking and using drugs and all that meant I had no social life. I had no standing anymore. I had no place to go. I had no place to be. I had no, I wouldn't be who I was in that regard. But that wasn't true at all. I was just literally letting go of the relationships I had that were all basically feeding into the only thing we can do is go drink drugs. And if we feel better doing drugs, we're better. When in fact, every time I felt better, I was getting worse in my thinking because I was relying on ideas that were not true and manipulating the effect, claiming to be now the cause by thinking the effect is all I need to focus on, not noticing the cause. The reason I'm trying to feel better all the time is because I'm causing an experience that's worse.
Yeah.
Right. So my sense is, if you think of modern day, we treat effects. If people don't pay attention in school, they get drugs for attention deficit disorder. If I'm their parent and 99% of my day is paying attention to what I think is happening and not what's actually happening, how much attention do I have left to pay to the kids and what they're doing and what's actually happening? I don't see them at all. I only see them as another excuse to try to figure out how to avoid having them see that I don't even look at them. I'm only seeing what I think of them, not who they actually are and not the essence. Because I'm denying the essence of myself, I'm certainly not going to go around and start recognizing it in everyone else. Doesn't mean it isn't there. It means I'm simply not thinking it's there. That means thinking has become everything, and reality and truth, which is everything, has become nothing. That is insanity. It's literally insanity. To think an illusion or a narrative is reality is to miss the creative potential of illusions and narratives and turn them into a liability, making believe that they become true. It's like going into a movie, even a comedy, and think because the movie's over, everybody's died. That the list at the end is the name of all the people that died making this movie, the cast, all the producers and everybody.
Right.
And
right.
Thinking is imagery. It creates image. You talked about it early on, this narrative you start to develop. And it isn't to say we shouldn't do that. It's what thinking does. But when we think it's real, it contaminates the wholeness of the thinking to the point that it becomes so desperate. All it does is constantly try to fight for its life, when in fact it has no life whatsoever to fight for. And at the same time, it's undermining our actual life because our body is responding as though there's a major threat. And it knows to be ready. Its instincts are saying something's wrong here, and we got to be ready for what the threat is. But the threat is wholly imagined. It's insanity.
There was something that you said, and it was, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I used to drink to not think, but I would also use to be this thoughtful, intellectual, like attractive, like boisterous individual. And
when you start seeing it honestly, the absurdity and the laughability of what we took so seriously as to think our life depended on it becomes the joke it actually is, and it's laughable.
And that's where I think being, and I know not everything, being a what we call a newcomer or just a new person into the rooms of a 12-step program, you see people laughing.
Yes.
And it's hard to wrap your head around.
Well, again, if you think of trying to wrap your head around it, it means that the laughter is expanding the limitations of what you thought your head represented. And all of a sudden, you're a little afraid to let go of the defenses that have been maintaining this minimization of your own thinking's capacity.
Yeah.
We talk about it. Now think about your head. Your head's already wrapping your brain. It's already, your brain's already fully wrapped. We don't have to do anything about wrapping it up.
True.
Right?
True. So, this is very true.
Well, and the irony of all this starts to become clear as And I'll suggest to everyone out there, we all watch what we're doing. We are all aware of what we're doing. We all know what we're doing. It can't be so that knowledge and reason, or knowledge and truth and reality, only occur to some and not others, if we are all products of it in some way. I'm not arguing for creation. I'm not arguing for evolution. I'm suggesting that everything everyone has thought is probably in some way true and accurate. It's probably a culmination of things that we're so quick to try to come up with a thoughtful answer that's thoughtless, that we're missing the fact that everything that's happening is happening the way it's happening, regardless of whether we think of it accurately and define it fully. And to try to go off on those endless loops of look at the books that have been written trying to make sense of what we're doing that makes absolutely no sense. Philosophy is a great example of it. A lot of it is just basically written to serve the thinking of the person writing it, who happens to be a great writer.
Right.
That doesn't make it true. It makes more self-serving thought at more educated levels seem to be something to wallow in, rather than notice that the whole time that was being developed, everything was doing exactly what it was doing, exactly as it was doing it, without any exception whatsoever, or argument, or debate, or necessity for thinking to confirm it. None. It really allows thinking to be what it's designed to do, which is a product of our ability to function our bodily resources effectively amongst others and with other things. All those we think of inanimate objects as somehow inferior to us, and yet they operate without thinking at all perfectly in everything that they do. Every atom and every molecule and every muon and all of the things in the universe are just functioning exactly as they're designed to. None of them arguing whatsoever. There's no emotional depression, and the wrinkles of time in space. Space is not going to a plastic surgeon to get the wrinkles removed.
Yeah, I was just thinking about two rocks going to couples therapy.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist.
Well, actually, the therapy is being a rock. It's the therapeutic advantage is being what is, having what is. When things are allowed to be as they are, you know the thing in physics that says two of the same thing can't occupy the same space at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
So when our thinking allows things to be what they are, there's nothing there. We're free. That's the ultimate freedom Bill was offering. Happy, joyous, and free was starting to realize that the old thinking, he talked about letting go of old thoughts, absolutely. What are old thoughts? Thoughts about things now that aren't happening, thought of as happening now, rather than just realizing, no, I'm thinking about it now, but it's not happening. It's a much different experience to say, oh, I'm thinking about something that's not even happening, so I must not be thinking much about what is happening. Well, that's a diminished capacity. That doesn't mean I don't have capacity. It means that I'm distracting my attention with something as though it's there and not paying attention to what is actually there. What am I going to do? If I'm doing that driving, it might work for a while. But if I'm not paying any attention, I'm going to run into something in a matter of time and probably have some vague sense that something's wrong before I hit the wall.
Right.
And being numb to how we feel, numbness is actually the evidence of pain rather than the absence of pain. To become desensitized, as I suspect we have by talking about it in terms that aren't true, and try to manage those terms as a defense against the actuality of what's happening, we've desensitized our beings or our human nature when in fact we're sentient beings. Our whole nature is to be sensitive. Our whole nature is to be aware. Our whole nature already is aware, and we're acting as though we're not, to dumb down our experience to make it look simpler and more practical, when in fact it's the most complicated, impractical thing we could possibly ever try to achieve. And we're living proof and witnessing the consequences we've created as a result.
I feel like we can go back to the sort of thinking about you're driving your car and eventually you're going to crash. Sometimes it's easy to feel like, and I think you said, eventually you're going to realize that you're about to crash or you are crashing or whatever. And I think that it can be easy to equate that sort of thinking to ways that you're living your life or thinking where it feels like it's too late to change something.
Yes. But think about that. The only thing that ever happens in the present, and we think it's too late to change something. Think about that. Things that have already happened, you can't change. They've already happened.
Mm-hmm.
The moment is the culmination of all those things that have happened. If we have any hope of doing anything that's hopeful rather than hopeless, it's what we do now with what we have now, because now is, in fact, the representation of all things that have ever happened. In any way anything has ever happened is happening right now. If somebody took a step in the sand somewhere and the wind hasn't blown that away, that step is still sitting there waiting for us to see it. It isn't an accident. It's not a coincidence until coincidence is seen as coincidence, meaning simultaneous, happening now. It's not something over there, and I got to think about it and I'll get back to you. I'm asking God for help and God's not answering. Think about that. We've humanized God and dispirited our own experience and think constantly we need more and more spirit, that he and they are really spiritual because they wear cotton swabs on their head or in some way act that way, rather than realize you can't avoid spirituality. And it's just a word for an essence that can't really be described because it doesn't fit within the confines of what thoughts are designed to do, which is to deal with dimensions and space and quantifiable definitions. And yet we seem to have a knowing awareness that's able to even begin to consider something absolute, because we get very frustrated when we do. we seem to know that what's frustrated are the limits of our own attempt to perfect that reality, rather than concede it and simply begin to notice that it's already our current awareness and always have been. But we've been using our thoughts and our thoughts and our thoughts and our thoughts so exclusively, we thought that was our source. Major interruption in thinking, but not reality, because the reality has never changed. It's always been exactly as it is, and we all know it. Jack Kerouac said, which I've repeated many times, that the enlightened man recognizes he's always been enlightened. And I imagine in this day that includes women. And did then too, because he included a lot of women. Isn't it funny? You said earlier you thought you thought you had the world by the balls, and yet we call the world Mother Nature.
Right. I so was like, I don't want to say it like that, but I did.
Well, but we think of things in general. We think of God as a man. We think of the earth as a woman. And yet we want to have the world by the balls. So apparently transgender issues have gone on a long time.
Yeah. I don't, that phrase. But boy, did I think that.
Your sound is fading a little bit.
Oh, is it okay? Is that any better? Is that better?
I think so.
Okay.
It may be turned backwards, your mic.
Yeah, I probably flipped it. Can we, the thing that we kind of glossed over, and I think is something that the ego, I think egotistical.
I'm losing you.
You can't hear me?
Very, very low.
Okay.
Try again. I just turned mine up way up.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay.
That may have been on my end.
Okay. Going back to ego, and I think the negative connotation typically of ego, of course, egotistical. The different aspects of the ego, to me, often get skipped over. My ego has kept me in recovery. And to me, that's not the negative aspect of an ego. And I can utilize my ego, I guess, to stay in recovery, feel like I'm being a good person. I know the way. I'm not now communicating it, but I'm interested to hear your take on the different aspects of the ego.
Well, there's one aspect.
Okay.
It either exists or it doesn't exist.
Mm.
And if we create from thinking a self that we think is born from thinking of itself, then that isn't reality. That's fantasy.
Mm.
And to think that that thing is real is the only time we start thinking about the ego in all these different ways. Like people say, oh, my ego got the best of it. Think about it. We're talking about it like it's a dog that we have on a leash. We think of it as though it's real. It's happening to us, not by us. This isn't created by me. This thing is happening to me, and I'm a victim of it. And if we are absolutely responsible, like we talked about earlier, there is no victim in absolute responsibility, none. What does that do? It puts me in the seat of driving the train that's giving me the impression that I have a self and an ego to even think about because I call it myself, my ego, etc., rather than these are my thoughts. These are thoughts I'm having. These are thoughts I'm choosing. More than that, to set them off in a motion that gives me the impression that they have a life of their own that can intrude on my, people talk about intrusive thoughts, like they have a life of their own. Think about it. They have to have a life of their own to be able to intrude on me. Cancer doesn't tend to exist where the host isn't somehow capable of providing space for it. There's no room for disease, there's no disease. But if you're swimming in a toxic pool and you think being in the shallow end is going to be less toxic, that's what we tend to do with ego. We constantly think we're going to get. Bill Wilson did not say, try to refine the ego you think you are into a really fine point so you can finally make a point about your life.
Right.
What did he say? Let go of old ideas, absolutely. What's the old idea? That my thinking that was incorrect, that I could drink with abandon, that I could use drugs with abandon and no consequence, that I could control and enjoy them, that I could do it like I saw other people do it where they stopped when they had enough, that all those things were true for me when in fact they were never true in my experience whatsoever. So what was I? A liar, capable of creating an impression that became depressing in time because I maintained it so long. There was nothing else it was going to do because the impression's trying to impress on me that I'm doing something wrong. My nature, my guidance system, my body language is giving me perfect feedback for what I'm doing all the time. And if I'm desensitized, I have to wait till that problem. Think about what we talk about. Pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. Interesting. Interesting. We need to feel it before we're willing to grow. Why? Because up until that time, we think we got it under control. I can handle this. I can manage this. It's a pain tolerance thing. How much pain can I take and not feel? Well, how much denial can I continue to maintain and make believe that I'm actually denying reality? That's what I'm really asking is how long do I want to act insanely? How long do I want to choose insanity as my reality? Because insanity is making believe that what isn't real is real. That's exactly what a lie does.
Yeah.
So the whole concept, as far as I'm concerned, Bill Wilson says, let go of old ideas, absolutely. Completely abandon yourself. Think about that. Normally, he says, you may wake up with disturbing thoughts or doubt. You may. You may have this, you may have that. This may come. He was very free to give us a little bit of room to say, yeah, we do sometimes, we don't sometimes. In these instances, he doesn't at all. He says self-centeredness is the problem. And what self-centeredness is really thinking-centered in thinking. It isn't a self-centered in thinking. It's us thinking about our thinking about our thinking about our thinking and thinking someday this is going to get better, while in the meantime, it feels like hell.
Yes.
So what's the meantime? Think of the meantime. It's mean. The meantime is the present, that we're suffering these mean things that we're doing that are literally self-abuse to the self we think we're trying to maintain. We're killing ourselves in the moment by addictively setting off all the chemicals in our bodily system that think it's an emergency. So when we have an emergency, we got no chemicals left. And all those chemicals create well-being when they're used properly, and they do not create a sense of well-being when they're overused for things that aren't happening. We subject our bodies as though it's an emergency, but the emergency is the thinking we're doing about trying to create reality. That's it. We're trying to emerge a reality which becomes an emergency because the body says something is seriously wrong here. Reality is already real. The body isn't thinking, it knows. It knows reality. It is reality. It's the absolute, it's like the mirror wouldn't reflect the image as clearly as we see it if the mirror was obstructed with all other images.
Yeah.
So it's the clarity of, like, white is the clarity of all colors, tends to be what canvas is. Gesso tends to be white.
Mm-hmm.
Canvases are white so that you can play with color on top of it. But white is, in fact, the combination of all colors. So it becomes both the silence that allows noise to be noticed. If everything was so noisy that you couldn't hear anything, there would be no distinction in noise. So it's the absence of those things that creates the potential for those things. It's the not the negation of them, but simply the absolute state of being that doesn't function in a relative space or world or time or place, but just is as it is, as it is, as it is, always in the present. It doesn't flux and flutter when we, Shakespeare said in Sonnet 116, love does not change when we change. He said, alter. He said, love does not alter when altereth it finds. Meaning it's stable, it's absolute, it's complete, it's whole. It isn't something that's in pieces and parts. It isn't something that's potentially in conflict. It isn't something that can come and go that we can have more or less of. It's an absolute state of being and knowing, and we all know it. To think we don't is where that whole cataclysmic crescendo of this reactive thinking begins to think that it's got to figure itself out of a desperate situation to finally save itself, when in fact it's creating it in the present moment by making believe more reliance on insanity is going to somehow become sane, somehow become reality, somehow become okay. It's all here. We have it right now. Absolutely. Without limitation, reduction, with no expectation. Doesn't have to be, we don't have to think it's that way for it to be exactly that way right now.
The first time we spoke, I said, I love it. And you said, it's just that, love. Yeah. I was like, and then I said, you blew my mind. And I forget what the retort was for that, but
I said a single breath blows smoke and mirrors away.
That's what it was.
Yeah, the smoke that was clouding the mirrors. So to your other question, though, how do we live doing this?
Yeah.
And my answer was, it's amazing we've lived not doing this so long. We've had almost 400 major wars through modern human history. Those are all emblematic of the kind of righteousness that comes from this thinking, to think what we need to do is kill another group of people because they don't think like us. Right? So that's the same thing. We're all living in that same threat, but we're posing the threat to our actual body, this thing we call ourself very often, to our human experience. We're undermining our ability to be healthy and have a sense of well-being that provides prosperous thinking for others, that provides an abundant approach to inclusion and giving people the latitude to think whatever they want and realize it's just a thought. They're having a thought like I have thoughts. When I take my thoughts seriously, I get super concerned over what everybody else is thinking right away, because I know they can't possibly be thinking as insane as I'm thinking, even though their thinking is as insane as they're thinking. I get very concerned about what people are thinking and how I look, because it's all about appearances now. There's no substance in appearances. So if we have been able to function by scraping and digging in and having ambition and learning confidence and trying to overcome nature, worthy of it, when all of a sudden you realize we're worthy of it by simply existing. We wouldn't exist if we weren't worthy. We wouldn't exist if we weren't given this. We wouldn't even be here to think about not existing and shouldn't exist and shouldn't be and shouldn't do if it weren't for absolutely being here right now. We couldn't even think those thoughts. It's like thinking about dying. We never think about dying. We think about dying from a thinking brain thinking about it.
Yeah.
When in fact, death and reports of death, and there's a couple of links on the announcement, if you go down and look, Dr. Christopher Kerr, and there's another Dr. Bruce Grayson, who both do near-death things. And what I realized in near-death experiences, and also people who witness people dying that aren't near-death, but are actually just transitioning, is there's an absolute reckoning of life that is consistent between them, almost in all cases. an awareness that is so profound that people can't even put words to it. And then they go right ahead and try because they so desperately want to share it.
Mm-hmm.
They're so happy to have something to say that they know is just so meaningful. But the fact is, we still haven't come to terms with the fact we all know it. We don't have to experience it to know it. My contention is, why do we have to die to get to the point where we actually notice life? When it isn't death we're afraid of, it's life now that we're afraid of.
Right.
Because actually facing that life and love dispels all the rumors of bullshit that we've been maintaining, and we even blame it on the bulls rather than call it human shit. So it becomes more practical to work when you recognize the inherent nature of each other and start working in favor of each other, just like we're asked to do in sobriety.
Yes.
Trust God's help, clean house, serve others, right? But those are in order. Those are in order. The trust is starting to realize there's something to actually trust that's faithful. Most of my faith historically was in faithless things. So I think I need a huge amount of faith in God when I don't. All I need is any suspicion that there may be something that's infinite, maybe something that's absolute, maybe something that doesn't come and go based on what I think. And all of a sudden I have a sense of confirmation that is profound because it's never been lost. And if you think of the word profound, it's for finding. If I'm constantly seeking, I must not be finding what I'm looking for. So I must be looking in all the wrong places. Why? Because I'm looking to my thinking to find it. It's already here. Doesn't need my thinking. An infinite space can't come and go. An infinite source can't come and go. It can't be more or less. It can't be there and not here. It's just present all the time. So knowing that, intuition is described, and Bill Wilson says, we intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. Well, what's intuition? Knowledge beyond reason, meaning no understanding, no thought whatsoever involved. What does that mean? If it's possible for us, we must know more than we think. We must have an absolute nature. We must be beings that actually precede humanity. And if I'm thinking all I am is what I think, all I think I am is a body. And my body is at risk because it's at some point going to degenerate and disintegrate in the sense that the integration of all the pieces and parts and the molecules that make it up and make it the form that it is will go back to their essence, which isn't going anywhere at all, but being where they've always been, just in another form. So these life forms aren't life. They're expressions of the possibility life has to offer us an opportunity to experience our own experience with each other. And that means everybody, not just somebody's. So thinking in those terms all of a sudden changes. You know intuitively what to do because you know if it's productive and beneficial immediately, because you feel confirmed in the same way you start to feel confirmed by conceding that there's already an absolute source. And it becomes laughable to make believe that all of a sudden you're going to go back to your thinking as the sole source when you can sit still for a minute and say, wow, I actually know a lot more than I think, which is really an awakened meditative state. And my sense is Bill's giving us meditation and prayer. All of our choices are prayers. We're always asking for something we want, and they're always answered, always, immediately, not 20 minutes later, not when we think God's answering it in the way we want. We're waiting until God tells us the answer we want to hear. Think about it. God's busy. God's infinite, but God's really busy today.
Right.
We think of God as a human. He does things humans do. He holds us in contempt. He hates us. He's vengeful. He's pissed off. He's going to kill us if we don't behave. And it's a he, by the way.
That's the gender thing. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was just thinking as you were saying he. Yeah.
It's interesting, right? It means God has a penis. Don't tend to talk about that. That's a big, if guys struggle for size, that would be the big one.
Yeah.
And it's considered heresy to even think in those terms because of this sort of sacred nature. But it isn't sacred if we've been using it in a way that is actually depleting our capacity to express that absolute knowing nature that is so loving that it's never come down here and said to any of us, stop thinking the way you're thinking. Stop doing what you're doing. It's given us that freedom to come to terms with what we're doing on our own. And that's ultimately what love is. It isn't interfering. It's letting people go. It's letting them have their way. Bill says it in the book when he says that if you think you can keep drinking, our hat's off to you. Tell us how it goes. Maybe you'll come back and report to us how it went. That's freedom. It's giving. The one thing we each seem to have is freedom of will, freedom of choice. And my sense is that will is choice. Every choice we make because we want something. Every decision we make because we're hoping things are the way we're thinking of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that hope very often leads us to deny how things are and ends up subjecting ourselves to risks that we would otherwise, as a smarter, less ignorant step, have an awareness to and say, wow, I really don't like that this may be the case. But if I don't like it, it may be because it's no good for me and it's no good for anyone else. And it's maybe not the best thing to act on. And take a breath. What does the book say? Pause when agitated.
When agitated, yeah.
And what's the agitation? That sense that something's wrong. And the more of a meltdown we go through in terms of our awareness, the more those things become obvious. And pretty soon you can sit still and know that there's an absolute peaceful nature, and interjected are thoughts about things going on that aren't always that peaceful. If it weren't for that clarity as a backdrop, we would not know what's wrong. We would not suffer. That absolute nature gives us the freedom to utilize suffering, just like a textbook gives us the freedom to provide information about a subject that we've never exposed ourselves to. So it lays it out. And our body language is telling us that, and we're functionally illiterate to make believe that what we need to do is feel better and get over what we're feeling, because we're trying to abandon it and wonder why we feel abandoned in the universe, and we feel separate in the universe, and we feel alone in the universe. We can't possibly be any of those things ever, but we can think we are, and as a result, we can feel like we are. Feelings follow thoughts. Feelings are the effects of thoughts, which are the cause. That's the primary motivator.
When you mentioned, and I absolutely agree, looking at, I forget how you say it, but just being aware of the way that you say things.
Watching our words.
And I start out a lot of my sentences, the things that I'm saying, with I feel.
Right.
And
which is feelings a wrapped up thought. It's an emotive expression of a thought. And if you listen, and I'm going to let you continue in a second here.
Sure.
But
Sure. Yeah.
If you listen to people when they talk in meetings, which is a free forum to say what you want, you hear people say, I feel really bad. I feel wrong. I feel this. I feel displaced. They're identifying their thoughts. They're not identifying themselves, but if you hear them, they're saying, I feel bad. Right? They're identifying thoughts. They're saying, I am bad. They're thinking, I am bad. I am wrong. I am disconnected. Right? Because they think their thoughts are who they are. That's a horrible place to be in a universe where you're seamlessly connected, and all of a sudden you are the odd person out. You have no place. You don't fit. You don't belong anywhere. And what you've done was make believe that a thought that has no place, other than in your thoughts, all it is existing space in your own thinking. It starts with thinking, ends with thinking. It doesn't have any reality. If it had some connection to reality, we would be acting on that naturally, just like we take all the other actions that are productive during the day. We open our eyes and we start seeing things. We don't open our eyes and say, why did I do that? Why? There's so much we're doing naturally that we're not thinking about. And if you begin noticing it, you start noticing the thinking we do that collides with everything, that seems to then get bigger and bigger the more we focus on it. And all of a sudden my hands is in front of my face and the world looks like a bunch of fingers. And it sort of, we lose perspective. But for the most part, we're defining our thoughts as our feelings, and our feelings as who we are, rather than something we're doing in thought. So when we're feeling wrong and feeling bad and feeling loathsome, we are thinking wrong and bad and loathsome thoughts, period. So we have the capability to do that. We're free to do that, absolutely free. So to notice that is to say, oh, well, I'm also free not to do that. That's exactly what recovery is with alcohol or any drug. When I admit I'm powerless, what am I admitting? The thought I had about it never had any power. The thinking that constantly drove me to try to prove I could do it was the thought that I could do it with abandon, without consequence, that it would always get better, that feeling better was enough, when in fact feeling better helped me get better and better and better at thinking worse. Because I got more and more deceptive and more deceptive. And what did I get? Depressed. What did I get? More anxiety, stress. Finally said, I can't do this anymore. People kill themselves over that direction. because they think the self they're killing is simply that their thoughts are who they're killing. They're trying to stop their thoughts because they think there's no way out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an absolute way out in thinking, just as there is with every other compulsion. There's 150 different 12-step programs and other programs that deal with compulsivity and substance abuse. And my sense is the mental substance abuse is thinking a lie has substance. We're abusing
Yeah.
the word substance by making believe that something that doesn't exist can be substantive.
Mm.
There's no connection to reality. If it's substantive, it has a connection to reality. We're confirmed thinking it because we're in union with everything. We can express it and benefit everyone by expressing it, because anybody who doesn't think that way could look and say, oh, I can do that too. He can do that. I can do that. I can ride a bike. I can drive a car. I can get a job. I can be productive. I can help others. Yikes.
It's interesting the way. So going back to the I feel thing, it's interesting the way I use it is to almost give a disclaimer in my thought, in what I'm actually going to say. It's like this filling this space of, hey, I could be wrong, I could be right, I don't know, but here, just to let you know, this is what I'm feeling. So you take it as you please or whatever. And then it follows with the rest of what I'm saying.
Well, and your knowingness actually is telling you, I could be wrong, I could be right. If you're listening to that, you're hearing things a lot clearer than you probably did when you were drinking obsessively or compulsively and using drugs compulsively. Because typically, in the midst of compulsions and expressions of those things, we're not thinking those things at all, because we're trying our best to make sure that all we think about is what we think is true and real, which means we're not thinking about truth and reality or not, at all. We're thinking only about what we think as reality and truth. And that's exactly what the obsession is. We can all think insane thoughts and not be considered insane by medical definition, because we can be aware that something's wrong. We can notice that something may be right, may be wrong. I don't know. I'm just thoughts. When I share them, I say, I don't know if it's right or wrong. I know that it works. It has worked. I don't know that it will always work. Having a little bit of skepticism in the confidence of thought is a very good first step with thoughts, because it begins to delay the tendency of making believe everything we say is true and real. It begins to interrupt that flow. And all of a sudden, you'll intuitively know things that you will say, well, I know this. How do you know it? I don't know, but I know.
Right.
Boom. Then you're starting to really notice that, okay, that's our nature, is knowing what to do where we're not thinking. And then what thinking's doing is helping the body function in the direction we've chosen to go, which means if it's been busy trying to determine reality and truth, we've been dysfunctional in the capacity of our body to express these things functionally and literally with other people. Literally and literally. As literally as tellers of stories of the moment, of simply expressing a narrative we'd like to see happen. It's not coming true like fairy tales. It's just a transformation of form.
Sure.
We don't create reality. We just take what's existing, because if reality is already all real, everything that is. We're just changing it, creating something out of it. We're making something. As an artist, that's all that it's about, is inspiration, putting inspiration on paper or building it into a stone, and turning it into something that stops somebody for at least a second, and they say, oh, wow. They're reminded of something that's essential to their experience, and you've given that. It's a gift shared openly, publicly.
The thing, just going back to the I feel,
Yes.
and just listening to what you're saying, it's almost me wanting to remove. The reason I bring it up is the desire to remove that, like, I could be right or wrong, and just having confidence in the thing that I'm saying.
Yes.
Not to be arrogant, but to be confident in the thing that I'm saying, and not be so worried about the outcome of what it is that I'm saying. And that removal of I feel, that's where I feel as I'm saying it.
Yeah.
That removal of I feel gives me that sense of confidence that I'm looking for in my words, and just expressing my expression and not feeling like I need to be judged or I'm going to be judged in saying those things.
You'll be judged. Don't worry about it.
But I don't want to care about the
But
judgment.
the judgment is, in fact, the refinement of your ability to notice what's happening.
Mm,
We talk about judgment. We're not worried about judgment. When judgment, I mean, here's how a thought being thought to be real becomes delusional. We think judgment means spite and contempt.
yes.
So it isn't the judgment we have of other people, because brains judge. That's what it does. It's assessing and analyzing and weighing and contrasting and comparing. That's what it does. So when people say, I don't judge anymore, I say, well, really, that's a judgment.
Fair.
Right?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
again, that transition, we have demonized aspects of our functional capacity that are actually very helpful and useful. Like people say, well, what do I do when I stop thinking? I say, you're not going to stop thinking. You just have freedom not to think obsessively is the only thinking you can do. That's a very different approach to thinking and saying, I'm always going to be thinking. My brain thinks. It thinks at night. It comes up with dreams and it translates. I hear water and I think I'm peeing. I mean, it's just busy trying to make sense out of the sense coming into it. So my sense is the feeling, like part of what you're saying, if I'm getting it, is you're noticing that you have a very different sensation to your knowing, which isn't about feeling, it's just about knowing. It's just and I heard someone once say who claimed to have been visited by a couple of ascendant masters, spiritual masters, who gave him a view into what out-of-body experience is. And he said it wasn't feeling, it was just pure bliss. It made an orgasm seem faint. Right? Because now you're really in the bliss of consciousness, and an absolute consciousness that's just consciousness. It isn't thinking, it's just a present state of being that's absolute, right? So that definition was interesting, because to know we know is to have confidence immediately but not need it. And to know we know is to have faith but need very little of it, because if you have faith in something that's faithful, you immediately are confirmed by having the faith. You don't need any more, because you know it's real. You know it's going to work. You know that 2 + 2 is 2. Once you get to that point in mathematics as a kid, you don't have to go back to the basics and go back to first grade to start learning it all over again every time you want to add 2 + 2 or 3 + 3. You get it. You know it. You apply it. So the application in sobriety, it's about practice the principles. The application of the principles confirms whether they're actually principled or delusional.
Yeah.
Because we are capable of creating experiences where we think we're on the high bar, and we are not on the high bar. We're on the bar getting high. So the capacity we have to delude ourselves, especially as long as we've been doing it, is great. But getting better at doing what is natural comes quickly, because it is not abnormal and unnatural and unhealthy, as has been so much of the obsessive thinking we've been doing so long. We think everything requires, to get to perfection, we need to work hard, when in fact, if you let everything be what it is right now, it's all perfect. If you stop comparing things and let them be, because they already are, by the way. It's like people talk about acceptance. Well, when I accept things, everything's fine. I say, well, everything was fine before you thought you needed to accept them too.
Wow.
It's our own thinking about them that we think that we're talking about accepting. What we're accepting is that everything already has its own thing, whatever it is within this experience. It's already doing what it's doing regardless of our thinking. So now I don't have to accept it to know that they're all acceptable. If it's happening, it's just happening, period.
Yeah.
That's the broad acceptance, where I start realizing I don't have to deal with every issue. I begin to deal with the fundamental aspect of my thinking. And all of a sudden, now my thinking starts aligning with my knowing, and I start seeing things in wholesome ways, like you just described. I think was a very good example of starting to see the pieces. You can't see the pieces of knowing and confidence as distinct from this right, wrong, want to know all the time. Thinking is always going to be in a quandary of some sort, because it's always reassessing immediately. It's an infinitesimal change going on all the time. And what's changing? Everything that's new is new every moment. It's not old. It's not what it was. It's new. It's new. It's new. It's new. It's now. It's now. It's now. It's now.
Yeah.
right? So if that's the case, we're always in the face of all possibility, regardless of anything that's ever happened, anything that we've always done or redone over and over and over. None of that stuff has any basis at all, except in the thinking we carve into the grooves we think exist that are hard to get out of because we've created a narrative that we believe is true and real because we think the thoughts we're having now are truth and reality. When you begin realizing they're just thoughts, all of a sudden all that stuff becomes an illusion and you're watching TV. You're not seeing reality, you're just watching TV,
Yeah.
So I think that insight, though, was very clear. So, and so too is many of the things you've said in our conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the stuff that, again, going from the child that I was, teenager to early 20s, and then even in sobriety and recovery, it's been about finding confidence in Neal, and of course trusting in a higher power. And these are this is like a God-given confidence, but yeah, it's been a long journey to be able to sit in this physical body and be as okay as I am.
Yes. So I'm going to give you a couple of things to go out on. And if you would like, I've tried to do, when I do one conversation, I try to do 2 or 3 with somebody because there's typically an arc in the conversation that comes. It's different when we know we're being recorded and listened to by other people than when we're talking alone.
Yeah.
And I like that because that's how we function when we go out the door in the morning. We're exposing ourselves to all kinds of people and all that. And any of the doubtful thoughts we have become more apparent because they become a little disturbing and we can sense the defensive, and all that kind of stuff can be reckoned with and recognized as we go through our day. Once we realize we're doing those things that aren't helpful, we start seeing them thinking, oh, I don't have to, what am I doing? I'm really afraid. Think of the term self-conscious. You know what it means by definition? You would think a self that's conscious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Undue regard for appearance.
Love that.
That's self-conscious. Now think about it. If the conscious self was conscious, it would not be undue regard for appearance. It would be absolute appreciation for substance. So I'm going to make a couple of points to you.
Yeah.
As you're on your path, and also, I was inviting you to a second and third conversation.
Please, would love that. Yeah.
We can even go further than that.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a development in the conversation and there's an arc. There's a getting used to the formula and the format, getting used to my tirades and sort of rambling, getting used to being interrupted, getting used to, the sort of back and forth is a little different, I would think, than in a general, going to the bank and trying to cash a check.
Sure.
But the challenge is if there's a challenge, is to really notice how challenged we think when we're thinking things that aren't true. And to do that and think that all we are is what we think is to constantly being in a world, seeming to be in a world that isn't true. So if we're peering out of that world, I'm going to give you some things to think about. Mm-hmm. There's no God to look for that isn't here now and isn't as you are. If we are told within sobriety we can't give what we don't have, then what would an infinite source give and offer? What it has.
Everything. Yeah.
Everything. And when would it do that? All time. And what would it be? All things. Everything. And everything beyond the everything we think is everything. And everything within the everything we think isn't anything. So to your point about waffling with, is this true? Is this wrong? Is this, when it comes to thoughts, I'll give you some reassurance. They're all wrong. Until they're all based on limited information at any given moment. Doesn't mean they're wrong in terms of being effective in the moment, but it means in the absolute sense, they can't be right because rightness is already right. It's already spoken for. The truth need not be told by anyone because it need not be told anything from anyone. It already is as it is, and it is the voice of reality in existence. It is the absolute, may seem silent, but is in fact it's like we're swimming in its pool all the time. And there's no way to get out of that pool because the pool is infinitely deep and infinitely wide and infinitely all that. There's nowhere to go, but always to be. So if it's always with us, there's no getting. There's no going. There's no displacement. There's none of that stuff. If reality is reality and truth is true, then it's absolutely always our normal state. That's natural. It isn't supernatural. It's just simply natural. And if nature is nature, we're a part of nature, human-wise. And our being is also part of that nature. And it's a knowing nature to allow all the things that we think are so incredibly vast to even occur. And all of a sudden, that vastness isn't that big, because it's the immediacy of reckoning with the fact that it's everything happening right now, and we're part of that everything. We're not apart from it. We are not a part in it. We are absolutely a part of something that's unlimited, that doesn't limit. It's not limited by our body and our brain, because our source, being spiritual or whatever we want to call it, would be infinite in terms of no time, no space, no bounds whatsoever.
Yeah.
Even within the dimensions that humans have created, by the fifth and sixth dimension, you're starting to enter into infinite reality. And they've come up with, I think, 13 dimensions. There's probably hundreds of them.
Right.
So the point is, if there is one, is that if the basis of our thinking about reality and truth is wrong, then everything we're thinking about in relation to reality and truth is also wrong, and would create a very, very disturbed existence. And for the most part, addiction, we talked about a little earlier, is a chain reaction. Just like nuclear energy works on splitting the atom, this is about splitting off our persona and ourself as being something distinct from reality and truth, by maintaining that the self we're trying to maintain and create and prove is in fact the creator of reality and truth, because we think thinking of itself creates the self we think of as self. That's insanity. And what's wrong is kind of like turning the key in the car when there's no gas and wondering why the battery's running out.
Yep.
And the starter's wearing out.
Yep.
The insistence to keep doing it is what causes the real problem. It isn't the doing of it that's the problem. It's the insistence of constantly going back to this same idea that somehow if I just keep turning the key, that car is going to start. And it's empty. There's nothing there to start. There's no gas. All the functional capacity of the car is diminished to zero, just like our functional capacity is diminished, to have us constantly feel so fretful over how to get somewhere, how to make something, how to become successful, how to have enough to be responsible and function on behalf of others, maritally or children or whatever we want to do. That tends to be the drive of the species, tends to have succeeded despite all the odds we've created. And if that nature is our nature, it's starting to operate on that basis, regardless of what we think, and start to see that thinking can obscure it, and thinking can conflict with it, and thinking can do anything I want thinking to do. I choose the content of those thoughts. And I'm insane to continue to think that somehow the thoughts that have never worked will one day work, simply because I keep insisting on redoing it. So that chain reaction in nuclear energy, when it isn't managed properly, creates meltdowns. What do we talk about? Nervous breakdowns. People have meltdowns. What happens? This thing gets to a point where we let it go so long and it gets out of control, because there is no control. Think about, we're trying to control something that doesn't exist. How much control could we possibly have?
Right.
So when we say it's out of control, we're actually saying words that are accurate. It is out, like no gas, of control.
Right.
No control. So when we admitted powerlessness, there was never any power. It was the delusion that we thought we had power that we were struggling and suffering from, and trying to drink ourselves through to get rid of the feeling we're creating by making believe something that was false was true.
Yes. Yes.
So if that's your reality, my reality, it's always been, even when we thought it wasn't. It always will be, even when we think it isn't. So thinking now gets put on a shelf of something we do, not who we are. You can start to see that, oh, this is just something I'm doing. Why would I do? Most people, like the question you asked about, how do I function? Which is what you were saying. How do I start to make money? How do I have confidence? When you're doing things that are real, you don't need confidence, because they're always going to pay off.
Sure.
Payoff may not be exactly what, it may not come in cash immediately, but you're going to get benefits of knowing you've done something for someone. There's a confirmation that you're actually acting in accord with reality rather than in opposition for it or in discord with it, disharmony. Just naturally happens. So the productivity, you start doing things And it starts paying off because now you're paying attention to what's actually happening, and you're starting to see people and what they're doing actually, rather than with all the hopes and wishes you have for them to do what you hope they will to get what you need, and all of a sudden get let down by them time and time and time again, and wonder why people keep betraying you.
Yeah.
In fact, you're setting the whole thing up. You're not even noticing this guy isn't that reliable, but there are some things he does that are, maybe I'll let that be the basis of my confidence.
Right.
So when we have faith in something that's faithful, it takes one amount of faith and boom, we know it's right, because we have a sense that is not disturbed whatsoever. It's at peace. There's a sense of harmony. There's a sense of, oh, yeah, wow, a little bit of awe, a little inspiration. You know, as an artist, when you start in those directions where you, like Enrique, my friend who's a painter, said, I knew I was a painter the day the painting told me when to stop.
Whoa. Wow.
and
Wow.
Because we were talking about this essence and this interactive capacity we have. And when he goes into a studio, he goes knee deep. He just begins, he's like, he'll make 8 paintings before the painting is done. And yet the succession of those paintings, you can feel when you stand in front of it. You can't see it, but you know something is going on that's way beyond the imagery that you're witnessing.
Yeah.
Because he imbued it, we're imbued, we're sharing it, we're witnessing it, and that offering is being conveyed in the fullness. I may interpret it differently, I may put different words to it, but the fascination for most of the artist friends I have is hearing what people have to say about their art that they had no idea about in relation to what they were thinking. Because that's the vastness, is to see how much can come out of it that isn't what they thought should be, what they thought people should think.
Yeah. That's what gets me when people say they don't understand art.
Yeah, well, they're thinking about it a little much.
Yeah, or it's just like whatever you're feeling.
Well, it's like saying I don't understand the understandable, the ununderstandable, the misunderstandable. You know, it's of course you don't understand what it isn't about understanding. It's really about penetrating, not even penetrating. It's about noticing that the knowing nature of our experience. What's interesting in art, my take, is that the camera was invented sometime around the 1850s. Interesting, if you look at art history, that's about exactly when abstract art started developing. Why? There was no longer a need to try to replicate things literally, and all of a sudden people started approaching it much more sentiently, where you were looking at imagery that almost seemed like a dream, and yet it was an abstract landscape that penetrated the typical expectation of figurative art. And there was an awe to that. So odd that people thought it was awful and didn't even call it art. Some of the original Monet and all those guys in France had to have their own salons set up because the galleries wouldn't have anything to do with it. Just like rap music.
Right.
You know, one year it wasn't even music. The next year it was the most celebrated, awarded vehicle. So we're resistant to that change because we get married to these ideas thinking they are reality. They're not reality. They're always changing. They're always growing. They're always, the potential to operate in that fullness of that creativity is the potential to know exactly what to do and have so much productivity coming out of it. You don't even know what to do with it.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything. You don't have to spend it. You don't have to live a life that, tanks your system in the future when you don't think as clearly as you did when you made when you were more affluent or whatever. So we're not designed to take so much as to upend our existence. Nature is very frugal. It's very economical. It takes what it needs. It does not take everything else from the forest simply because it wants to be a bigger tree. You know, we're part of nature. I'm not saying you can't have more. I'm saying everything that exists right now, we got it all. We have it all.
Yeah.
And what we choose to be responsible for, and I mean in absolute terms, will determine what we are given responsibility for. Just happens that way. And I know lots of artists who go through trials and tribulations and struggles and with what they're doing. But when they get down to work, it starts to process out and starts to go in a direction where you can see that they're not only happy, they're in a communion that is spiritual. It's inspired. It's completely starting to actually, they're being confirmed by what they're doing, but they're thanking the thing they're doing for existing. There's a commonality to it that's much more appreciated. Great. My sense is that gratefulness is actually the fullness of greatness, that we're diminishing by making believe we're just these pitiful creatures who need humiliation to grow.
That process of making that you were talking about, to me, is the definition of inspiration.
Yes. Yes. So think of what that means. It means in spirit.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? Union, communion. It's actually functioning on a level that represents what's actually happening rather than the disjointed views that we think about what's happening.
Yeah.
So disconnected. People say, you hear it in meetings a lot, I feel disconnected. I feel alone. I feel lonely. Like, yeah, your thought is completely disconnected because it has no denominator. It's all numerator. The denominator is zero. There's nothing there. It ain't gonna add up. So I really appreciate this, Neal.
Me too.
I don't know there's anything more inspiring than to engage around this and start talking about it publicly, because my sense is if we think we have problems in the world, those problems are small in the face of the reality that we actually have to solve them and diminish them and right the wrongs that we've created, that we keep making believe we can deny and wonder why they're not getting better.
Yes.
This is a human dilemma. The potential is created within the human construct. If we think we know enough about space to know so much, and then didn't realize until recently we barely understood the bottom of the ocean, there's a pretty good chance that the thing that's been driving us the whole time has been overlooked and not looked at accurately. And the real hidden mystery seems to be what we're thinking. And it's no mystery at all because it's so obviously splattered around everything we do. If you just begin looking at it honestly, it becomes obvious that most of it's insane. It's just not healthy. It's not natural. It's abnormal. It's an allergy. An abnormal response to things is a reaction, to react over and over and over again, thinking the reaction is going to somehow solve the problem when it perpetuates it. Think about reacting to a thought that's only a thought as though it's real, and there's something to fight with the reaction. We become defensive and reactive to everything everybody says. Somebody says, some skateboarder came down the block the other day, and I kind of gave him a go ahead,
Yeah.
He goes, well, it's a public sidewalk.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, I'm welcoming you.
Yeah, you go, bro. Like, yeah.
But I am reactive like that. When I have those thoughts going on and I'm in the midst of them and I run into situations that trigger them, I'm trying to reinforce the defensiveness by justifying it's happening because something outside of me is happening, not what I'm doing. It's the premise of what I'm doing that sets all that up. And that's the responsibility. The beauty about coming to terms with responsibility as being absolute is recognizing that it's also absolute for everyone else. And to see that is to say that 8.5 billion people aren't the problem. 8.5 billion people are the solution. Because if we all share it accurately and we're simply just thinking about it inaccurately, it won't take long for people to get that, just like it didn't take them long to begin to entertain zero as a part of mathematics that hadn't been discovered for centuries. Once it took a little time. Some people thought it was voodoo because you could disappear things, but all of a sudden, worldwide, everybody was using it. And they didn't need tablets stored in barns on stone to count things anymore. They could do it on a piece of paper. Why? Because it was reflecting the actuality of what mathematics is, not just the limited potential that had been seemingly discovered, but actually, my sense is when we're thinking about knowing as being our nature, we're going to end up coming to terms with nature a lot quicker than it's taken us when we think it's a mystery and secret, and we need through a process of elimination to figure it all out when there's trillions and trillions and trillions of possibilities we have to go through chemically to try to do that. That knowing nature will have us know immediately what to do, and we won't even know why we're doing it, but we'll be doing it and saying, oh, thanks, I like that. That's better than thinking. And then the thinking will know exactly what to do because it'll be utilized in the proper, just like light passing through something. My sense is that light is the knowingness and the brain obstructs it to the degree that it creates colors like a prism. Some of those colors are depressing. Red and blue, anger and blue and yellow, fear and all that stuff. But the totality of colors is white, and that would be the absolute knowing basis of our existence. There's
Yeah.
no shadow in that whiteness, something that's very hard to even imagine, because most of the white we see has variations, unless you're literally in the headlights of a car and it's about 3 feet away.
Right.
Anyway, I love you. I love this, and I
I
appreciate
love this too.
that you're participating and coming to talk, and everyone
Yeah.
listening also. No matter
Yeah.
where you are out there, we are all a part of this same thing, and it isn't different between us except to the thinking we do. And it's not to suggest we can't think differently. We're designed to think differently. It's okay to think differently. The splendor and awe of the expressions we're capable of creating are designed to appease and please and satisfy and offer the grand nature of our existence, not to be used as a justification to fight and hate other people. So that's ultimately, I believe, the message of sobriety, the message of sanity, and the message that Bill Wilson saw from his hospital bed could be carried around the world to people who were suffering and struggling everywhere. And he knew it was a mental problem at its heart. So I want to keep talking about it.
Absolutely.
Love you, brother. Good.
Love you too. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Love you.
Love you too.